Welcome back to this Files One News special report, Exonerated, Guilty Until Proven Innocent. I'm Stone Grissom. Well, over the past hour, we've been chronicling the story of Frank Sterling, New York State's most recent exoneree, set free due to modern DNA testing. But Frank's saga represents a larger problem in the state: innocent people serving time behind bars. Frank's prospects look bleak, convicted of a crime he never committed and serving a potential life sentence. But what he didn't know was that he was about to get help from a very unlikely source.
Well, I knew Frank before he was prosecuted or convicted, so I knew that Frank wasn't capable of the crime that he was charged with and he was convicted of. So that was kind of an easy case to get involved in.
Don Thompson is a Rochester defense attorney and has been a champion for Frank's cause from the beginning.
His direct appeal was over by 1994, and fairly well immediately after the direct appeal, I began to become involved.
But it would take another 2 years before their first break came.
In 1996 is when the other suspect here actually confessed to committing another murder.
A guy named Mark Christie.
After Frank was convicted for Viola Manville's murder, Christie's neighbor, 4-year-old Kaylee Ann Poulton, went missing. Police questioned Christie but were not able to tie him to the crime. Until
2 years later, Mark Christie gets in a little bit of a brouhaha with his wife, and by all accounts confesses to her to having killed Kaylee Ann Poulton 2 years earlier. She does the right thing, thankfully, and calls the investigators, the sheriff's office.
Police had also interviewed Christie for Viola Manville's murder, but dismissed him and decided to focus on Frank Sterling instead. Now Frank's defense team could argue that Christie needed a second look, but it was far from a slam dunk.
Was there ever any point during your time in prison that you just lost hope?
Well, it was quite a few times, especially when the appeals came back denied.
How did you get through those periods?
A lot of prayer.
Frank's prospects were bleak indeed, convicted of a crime he never committed and facing the real possibility of dying an old man in prison. But what Frank didn't know yet is that the legal system was about to change its mind, with a little help from DNA.
The science has really grown up over the life of this case.
The science perhaps, but not the cooperation.
There were a few different types of DNA testing that we had asked for, all of them aggressively opposed by the prosecution.
And I understand we have an adversarial system in place, but everyone has the best interest for justice in mind. If we start from there, why would a prosecutor argue against DNA testing? What are the arguments that you hear?
Well, one of the most offensive arguments that I hear is this rule of finality. We should be done with cases at some point. We can't go back and revisit these forever. You had a direct appeal, you had a jury trial. Stop already.
Advice Frank's team wasn't about to take.
The Innocence Project agreed to come in and help by that point, so we had the luxury of saying, look, we'll pay for the testing. There'll be no expense to the state. All we need is access to the samples so that we can compare these tests against the known information, Frank's DNA.
But in New York State, access can often be a problem.
There's no requirement that the prosecution preserve the evidence, and there's no sanction if they don't.
Something Thompson says needs to be changed.
We got this statute in New York that allows you post-conviction testing for DNA if it wasn't available to you in the first place, but it doesn't have a lot of teeth if you don't have anything there that can be tested.
Thompson caught a slight break in Frank's case. The original prosecutor, although opposed to any DNA testing, did make an informal agreement with Thompson to preserve the evidence throughout the appellate process. It was that agreement that allowed science to catch up during the almost 18 years of appeals. When Frank Sterling was incarcerated, DNA testing was still in its infancy. At best, they were hoping for a test called mitochondrial DNA testing.
Mitochondrial testing will permit you to determine only whether the person who you're interested in or anyone in their mother's bloodline was involved. So it's not a terribly specific test. So your mom better have an alibi.
Now a new technique was available to the defense, a very costly DNA test called the touch test.
The touch DNA is something that's developed rather recently. It's a very highly specific and highly sensitive DNA test, but also quite expensive for that reason.
And unlike the standard mitochondrial DNA test, the touch test could point to the actual perpetrator. However, Frank Sterling's defense team kept losing in the courts. It looked as if Sterling would spend the rest of his natural life in prison. That is, until
I think he had to have some doubts.
the investigator who had originally obtained the confession from Frank Sterling intervened.
He said that he asked the district attorney to allow him to get a true DNA sample. He said all along, you know, if I'm wrong, prove me wrong.
In the end, science did.
Guess what? It does not match Frank Sterling, but it does match Mark Christie. I still don't believe it. Did 18 years for a crime I did not do.
Frank, along with 27 other exonerees in New York State, have had their cases successfully re-examined and their innocence proven. But with New York having more than 10% of all exonerations nationwide, the real question is, what is being done about it? And the answer may be not enough. I recently spoke about that with Vanessa Podkin with the Innocence Project.
A big problem we have in New York right now is the courts have interpreted our DNA law to prevent people who pled guilty from getting DNA testing.
So in New York State, if you plead guilty, you're precluded from getting any further DNA testing?
It's really outrageous. We're behind many other states. In Louisiana, you can get this testing. In Missouri, you can get testing. In many states throughout the country, they have explicitly recognized that if you plead guilty, you're still entitled to prove your innocence through DNA testing. Many people plead guilty not because they're guilty, but because they become convinced that it is the lesser of two evils, and this is what they need to do. We've had people who believed that they would get the death penalty if they didn't confess and plead guilty. And so there are many reasons why people plead guilty to crimes they didn't commit.
There have been some recent proposed bills sent to the Assembly and the Senate in New York. Are the reforms that you're seeing proposed, do they go far enough, or do we need to still go farther? Meaning, are we on the right track?
We're definitely on the right track. The reforms that have been proposed would be a great start for New York. The problem is getting them implemented. They're out there, they're on the table. We just need to get this legislation passed.
Reform bills currently being proposed in New York State include preservation of evidence for post-conviction DNA testing and the requirement that all interrogations be electronically recorded.
Coming up, life after prison. Frank Sterling tries to reconnect to a society he hasn't been part of for almost 2 decades. And later,
I didn't kill Timothy P. Hayward. Somebody else did.
in their own words, exonerees meet for the very first time. You're watching Exonerated, Guilty Until Proven Innocent.
Not one American job was